This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This week in Theology Bits, we are going to talk about the Reformation. As we are approaching Reformation Day and Reformation Sunday, it causes us to pause and say, what really is the center? Or what is really at the heart of Luther's Reformation for us today? Probably the most traditional answer to that question is the question of justification and sanctification. That division that Luther had of how are we made right, which is what justify means, made righteous, which just means made right with God. Well, in each individual, for Luther, there is God, there is the human individual, and they are made right not by anything that the human does, but by this action of God. They are justified in the cross of Christ. That is totally separate from anything we do. Now, this is often seen as the bedrock of Luther's insight, and the continuation of that, of course, is that very grace we receive is then expressed outwardly in the human life in what we call the sanctified life, or the life where the very grace that we receive expresses itself outwardly and we act as the means of grace, or the mask of God. And Luther's focus here is even in how this is expressed outward, it is not the human doing the work, but it is that very grace moving forward out into the world. And that's this idea of humans as the masks of God, which is to say that it is not the human doing the work, it is God within the human. That's often seen as a major focus, maybe a center. But then there's a lot of other things that will come up. Someone else might say, well, what about Luther's fundamental view on where is authority and the three solas, sola scriptura, sola gratia, sola fides. This idea of Scripture alone, grace alone, faith alone. Not tradition, not what other people are saying, but that our justification, our understanding of who God is comes from these principles, not other things. Others have said, well, those are, of course, all valuable things, but the real center of what the Reformation is all about is the priesthood of all believers. That Luther opened up who is righteous before God to absolutely everyone in relationship with God. There are no better or worse. And some would point that out of the way that sets up is the famous simul justus et peccator, that all humans are at the same time righteous and sinners. Saints and sinners at the same time. That another focus that you can have. Others would say, well, the really stemming from this Scripture alone thing was Luther's opening up the gospel into the vernacular, both in what language worship was being worshipped in, and then more specifically in translating the Bible into German and encouraging the translation of the Bible into everyone, and that Scripture opened up to people in new ways. Others would say, well, really what we're dealing with Luther is that fundamental distinction between law and gospel, the way in which the law convicts us and the gospel frees us. And yet others would simply say, well, it's not really about any of the teaching, but just the legacy for us is in the spirit of reform itself. That in the Reformation, just the purpose and point of how do we act and think differently as a people who are reforming people who are ready to challenge. And that could be a focus that can be had. And as we look at this, we see, well, these are a variety of topics that Luther emphasized. And of course, there's many, many others. And frequently in the Reformation, we can talk about that. What made Luther different? But the legacy of the Reformation, I would like to suggest, is not just in what made Luther different, but how the theology expressed in Luther and his contemporaries speaks to our world today. And that includes some things that were frankly not controversial. For example, discussions of sin and death. Yes, Luther applied them differently, but it wasn't really a big debate in his world. In our world, it certainly is. What do we mean by sin in the 21st century? Language of what is happening, say, at our baptism. Again, there was distinction in the sacraments and what they thought about the sacraments, but the fundamental action, not necessarily fundamentally different. Or simply the character of Jesus' death and resurrection. Again, you have differences in how it would be applied, but the very emphasis of it wasn't something that was in wild dispute. Or frankly, even what the character of faith was in the first place. Yes, indeed, there were many challenges to how that was expressed, what needed to go alongside it, what was its salvific plan, what's going on in those manners, but not challenging just what's there. So if we were going to look at what do we really see as the legacy in the center or the heart of the Reformation, well, it's not going to be one thing except for the cross of Christ. The spirit of the Reformation, the center of the Reformation, is not so much one particular doctrine, nor simply the idea of what is being reformed, but instead, who is Christ for us today? And so, as we lead into the Reformation, it is far less about what specific idea we have, what conviction we have, and instead is about the center of who is Jesus Christ for us today. I'd like to invite you to reflect on that this week as we celebrate Reformation Day. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.